So my task today is to come back to this issue of democratic transition and to get you to start to think more about how some of these issues work together to produce democratic transitional successes. And we should talk about what a success would look like, and democratic transitional failures. Now, I'll tell you right away, I'll show you where I'm going today. I'm going to distinguish between transition, which is the point of collapse of the old authoritarian regime, and the rise of a new, at least procedural democracy. So free and fair elections, what I think Larry introduced to you as Robert Dahl's conception of procedural democracy, right? So inclusion, contestation, it may not be perfect, but international observers and most internally can agree that at least that founding election is free and fair, regardless of what the outcome is. So that would be transition. Consolidation is whether or not that democracy lasts, that democratic system. So the reason we're going to look at the Soviet Union and Russia is because in this this book that just came out that I co-edited with Michael McFall, who used to be our director before Larry Diamond, he also works on Russia and Eastern Europe. He's currently serving as the US ambassador to Russia, sort of controversial ambassador, but it's fun to have him there to hear about how policy is made or is not made. He's been with President Obama now for about 6 years, working first in the National Security Council, and then just moving about 1.5 years ago into the ambassadorial role in Russia. In this book, we look at transitional successes and failures. In the next version of this study, or next stage of this study, we look at issues of consolidation. Russia and the Soviet Union are an interesting case, not just because I work on it, but because the Soviet Union we view as a successful case of transition. The old regime falls. There's a founding election in the successor state, Russia, that most agree to be free and fair for president and then for parliament. But ultimately, we now, in 2013, look at Russia, I think Dennis would agree, as a non-democracy, right? A failed consolidation. So the question is, how does this happen? And the reason that it's a particularly important question is if you look at this book, which some people consider a classic and some people consider worthy of a garbage can. It's called The Third Wave by Samuel Huntington, who was actually a mentor of Frank Fukuyama's and a professor of both of ours at Harvard, and probably professor of more people were probably trained by Sam Huntington than I'm aware of here. But he died about 2 years ago. He's a real guru of change and transition. In this book, he notes that most democratic transitions result not in democracy, but in fact a transition from one form of autocracy to another. So most actually fail. But the interesting or troubling, let me put it that way, thing about the way that we used to study democratic or transitions was that they were all successes. So every study, if you look at every study written, pretty much until very, very recently, they all focused on success. So they had this selection bias issue. But in fact, as Huntington points out, most don't succeed. And so we have what Larry called this democratic recession. Huntington calls it reverse waves. He talks about democratization occurring in waves, groupings of countries. So I want to talk about transition to what? And in this case, as I said, to initially the fall, we'll think of it in 3 steps. Initially the fall of the authoritarian regime. The second step being a founding election. So we're not adding all of those beautiful aspects of liberal democracy yet that Larry went through with you earlier this week. The third step would be consolidation. And in consolidation, we'll see all of those aspects of liberal democracy come through more clearly. I should also tell you that some people, Frank Fukuyama, for example, don't like to separate transition from consolidation. They think this is a false separation. But I actually think it's a very worthwhile separation, and Sam Huntington and many others do as well, because the causes of transition are often very, very different. That is what brings the fall of the old regime down, brings about the fall of the old regime, and the founding election. Those causes are very different than what produces the consolidation, that is the ongoing durability of a democracy. And then we'll look at what the general lessons are from Soviet Union and Russia, because we start with all of this hope. And as I go along, feel free to stop as well, because there are many countries represented in the room that have very, very similar patterns. And so I wanted to use this case, again, not because I feel I know it well, but because I think it's sort of emblematic. We could call it country X, but we happen to be calling it the Soviet Union, just to be honest about it. So first of all, what brings about the transition, the initial transition, the fall of the authoritarian regime? So it could be any number of these things. There's no single cause. It could be the death of a long-serving leader. We were talking at lunch yesterday. We were joking, really, about Mugabe and what will happen should he ever die. He clearly doesn't think he will die. The joke that you told yesterday, Manuel, was pretty funny, which was apparently a reporter asked Robert Mugabe, the long-serving president of Zimbabwe, what he will do, or what
when he would say bye.
Go ahead, yeah, you do it. You'll tell it better.
No, they asked him when he'll say bye to the people of Zimbabwe, and then he asked, where are they going?
When will he say goodbye to the people of Zimbabwe? When's he going to die? And his answer was, why, where are they going? So he may eventually die, even if he doesn't accept that. So what will happen in Zimbabwe when that happens? So presumably that's a trigger of a transition, whether it's a transition to democracy or a transition to another form of autocracy, we don't know. Could be defeat in war, decolonization, collapse of an empire, external occupation, as we see in Iraq. And actually, we have no Iraqis here this year. We've had Iraqis historically in this program, and it's very interesting to hear them talk about the invasion and whether or not it was successful. I don't know. We probably have selection bias, and I think we've chosen a lot from northern Iraq and Kurdistan, which is a different world, I think, from the rest of Iraq. But they're very bullish on the invasion, which I think came as a surprise to a lot of the Americans in the room. That is, they think it's good. It was a good thing. Some think economic growth, and we'll go through that. Modernization theory is what causes a transition. It causes changes in social structures. Some think economic crisis. So if you think of Egypt or the Arab Spring, was it economic crisis? Necessarily, they triggered these transitions out of autocracy. I don't think we can necessarily say they're all transitions to democracy yet. People are out on the streets in Tunisia over the assassination yesterday, and of course out on the streets again in Egypt. So a whole host of triggers. And one of the things that we tried to do in this book, Michael McFall and I, was to get authors on our 15-country cases, and we look at successes and failures, to talk about what the trigger was, what the regime was in place before, and whether that mattered. But there can be many causes, of course. A big question about transitions is whether or not there are preconditions for democracy. And I don't have time to go through all of the literature on this and various theories. But I want to focus in particular, since we're going to look at this case of the Soviet Union and Russia, on modernization theory. Did Larry go through modernization theory in any depth?
Yeah.
Steve did, right, okay, right. So he's talking about going up the escalator and somehow you get off and you're in was he going to Denmark? Okay, or Norway?
No.
It's not clear. He changes his destination every year, but I think it's Denmark. I keep waiting for Canada, but no one's going to Russia. Oh, Dennis is going back, I guess. Anyway, so it's basically this, theory that there, this observation starts with this observation, right? Very positive. There's a positive correlation between wealth and democracy, and the question is why? So the actors in this model are society, and just, to go through these points super quickly to refresh your memory on what Steve said. Either through industrialization, there is this change in social structure. As the economy begins to grow, people become more educated. They go into cities more for those jobs that Frank talked about in his first lecture on specialization, right? Remember the pin factory? The demands that we get, more people become owners, and they began to demand representation, and there's mobilization, and so we get a transition and a demand for representative government. People come out on the streets, right? So again, the important thing here in this theory of transition is actors. The actors are society, and the economy, growth, produces social change. So modernization theory wouldn't really fit the Arab Spring. I'll just, we can talk about that. But because it would seem as though inequality and lack of economic opportunity and stagnation is more what caused the frustration. So this was the dominant theory, though, of democratic transition from, I said, the 1960s onwards, even the 1950s. And the emphasis is, again, on economic change leading to social change. And the policy prescriptions for external actors, for other countries looking at prospective countries in transition, is help them develop their economies, right? Open up trade and encourage education and urbanization. So if we think back to some of what Carl Eichenberry said about Afghanistan, you can see this is kind of the implicit policy of the United States government in Afghanistan, right? And its allies. Help them grow economically, help them educate their population. What did he say? Something like they went from 1 million Afghan kids in school to 7 million in the last 11 years. All of this will create this constituency for representative government, and people will demand it. They'll become stakeholders in the system. They'll become modern. Okay, so what's wrong with this picture? You can probably think right away, and Steve probably mentioned it as well, because I've seen that lecture about 15 times, and it's better and better every time, what exactly is the wealth standard? How rich do you have to be before a country tips to democracy? Is it $5,000, $8,000? What dollars are we talking about? Are we talking about $1990? Are we talking about $2,000? Different authors and analysts have different views on this. One number that's typically plucked out of the air is 10,000 US dollars. Adam Jaworski is one of the theorists who talks about this. Could be 12,000, but somewhere around there, a lot of countries seem to tip toward democracy, toward a transition, and off they go. They get on the elevator that I know Steve talked about, and they get off near Denmark. Maybe just short, but near Denmark. The problem is, of course, that we have many, many wealthy countries. The United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, that have not had this happen, right? Their GDP per capita is well over 10 or 12,000 US dollars, and yet we don't see transition to democracy. We have seen some mobilization in different parts of the Arab world that are, countries that are wealthy. But this is one of, I think, the issues with modernization theory is knowing exactly what's the amount of money. There are also some very poor countries that have transited to democracy and have consolidated their democracies. So India is one that we wouldn't expect necessarily to have maintained democracy, transited and maintained. But the correlation is very clear. It's just hard to know what the direction of causality is, whether growth produces transition or the transition itself produces growth. Yep.
I was just curious, why would you call India democracy? Because this is
Why?
the 5th decade, the same family is in the power. I mean,
Well, it's not my personal judgment. I don't think there's any dispute within sort of the international community that India is a democracy.
international organizations can never monitor their elections because this is the part of their constitution, and there are a lot of problems with rule of law. Judiciary system doesn't work at all.
Sure.
I mean, but we still call
So
it.
if you looked at the places that measure democracy, Freedom House or Polity 4, they would score India as a democracy, because most people would view the process as free and fair. I mean, Japan, they've had, except for I think 4 years, the same ruling party since the end of World War II, right? But I don't, everyone would call Japan a democracy because the process
But
is
the
free
same
and fair.
family is not in the power.
Pardon me?
I mean, okay. In Japan, it's not in the power is not in the hands of group of people. I mean,
Well, you could argue that it's not because there hasn't been a turnover of the ruling party, just as you mentioned in India, there hasn't been, a turnover of the ruling family, although there has been, but you thought that there hadn't. It's not my judgment. We can look up Freedom House if anybody who has their computer open. Are you familiar with Freedom House, Lilith, and Polity 4? Yeah.
I didn't really look much into their indexes and how they measure it because
this is the problem with assessing it, right? But I don't think, Frank and Mark, would you say, would it occur to you that India today is not a democracy? It has huge problems, governance problems, but does it? It's a democracy. Yeah. So it's not disputed.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
I can say controversial things later, and you can dispute those. Gina and Fernando. Yeah.
Well, I keep having this question since maybe day one. And in this particular topic that we are talking about transition and the relations with economic growth, I think that most of the time what I've heard is economic growth just like an issue, like there is some economic growth. But it's not really related with development and with many other issues. So I'm wondering if maybe this theory or another one, it's going to address the relation not between the economic growth and something else, but the characteristics of that economic growth and the type of economic growth that creates maybe inequality or that creates maybe the elite being like the ruling or creates something related with the types of democracy that I thought we were going to discuss and we didn't. My question if the relation is with the economic growth as something to see, or the failures and the holes in that economic growth, because I haven't seen that clear since day one.
So maybe a lot of them are pictures, but I have 40 slides, and we're on 6. So we're going to get to that because that's a lot of the issue with consolidation of democracy, right? Why it fails ultimately is because it's inequality, performance, legitimacy. There's either not enough growth or there's unequal distribution of wealth. So we're moving in that direction about why transitions fail. So that today's the day we're going to start to talk about that. So I'm glad you raised it. Fernando.
Yeah, I think we might be leaving out of the picture a more pessimistic view in terms of the correlation between modernization and democracy. I'm thinking about the work of O'Donnell and others in the 60s, explaining how actually the prospect of modernization was the trigger for authoritarian governments.
Definitely
that was the case in Latin America, in regimes like Brazil, Chile, Argentina.
Right.
So I wouldn't say that the correlation remains because the evidence is not definite.
Absolutely. And so I'm actually going to, maybe I should have said this, I'm going to present 3 theories. There are more, but I'm basically grouping different authors whose names I'm sparing you for the most part, into three broad categories. So the first one is modernization. Does it fit everywhere? Absolutely not. But it is a dominant paradigm. And one of the reasons I wanted to mention the policy implications is because a lot of US aid policy and development policy uses this as a guide. Because it's kind of, there are clear policy prescriptions from it. The next theory we look at is elite pacting from the third wave. And this is really leaving society out. This is harder to, in terms of gleaning policy prescriptions, because it's about elites and getting into relationships between elites within a particular country, which is a harder thing to do, a more nebulous thing to do for an external actor. This is the concept of, first of all, let's talk about the waves conception. And again, this comes from Sam Huntington. And I mentioned, he refers to sort of this current wave that we're in, the third wave, that starts in Portugal in 1974 and then spreads to Latin America. We get reverse waves. This would be the same thing essentially as Larry's democratic recession. But Huntington groups democratic, basically when a core set of countries transits to democracy at the same time. He calls those waves. And then if you read his book, and it's a quick and sort of entertaining read because he's a very clear actor. His sort of most famous book that was written in 1967 is on transitions as well, and it was called Advice to Dictators, basically the last chapter about how they should stay in power. So he's a very clear, crisp writer, and he's got a lot of bullet points, but he, especially for dictators who want to stay in power, in this book, he does a nice job, I think, of just kind of grouping a lot of history together. So he says this first wave of transition begins in 1828 and runs up through the First World War into 1926. And the main cause there is industrialization. And this is, he says, really where modernization theory is deriving its examples. Industrialization causes this change in social structures, and we can think back to some of what Frank presented in the very first lecture of the program, right? So we see urbanization, increased literacy, and then more open government. The second wave he attributes to changes in government that happen starting during the Second World War, but continuing past the Second World War through decolonization. And here he's looking at African countries. He's talking about Latin America as well. Again, there are reverse waves, so exactly what you mentioned, Fernando. That is where countries revert back to authoritarian regimes. And then this third wave, which is really what this book, which is appropriately called The Third Wave, is about, begins, as I said, in Portugal in 1974, and he brings it up to 1989, the book is published, I think, in 1992, so the Soviet Union is just collapsing as it goes to press, and poor Sam Huntington isn't able to include the collapse of the Soviet Union in this book. And in a second, I'll show you that his paradigm of the third wave doesn't really fit the transitions that occur after 1989. So here, the conception or the idea of transition is that it is an elite pact. The main actors here are not societal. The transition is not brought about by social change or change in social structures and popular demand as much as it is by elites who are frozen in relationships in opposition to one another. And the only thing they can do in order to have a reasonable chance of staying in office or in getting back into office is have elections. And so they sit down and decide the basis on which these elections will be run, and this is a pact. And so this conception of pacting came really from Latin America and Southern Europe, beginning in, as I mentioned, Portugal. And the idea is that you can control the pace of transition. You can write a constitution and rules and laws. It is the best of otherwise bad alternatives. Either you're going to have a civil war or a continuing civil war, or you're in a situation as an elite where you're going to have no shot whatsoever of getting back into power unless there are elections. So the way that the theory goes, and it's the sort of main proponents of this are O'Donnell and Schmitter. Again, they're looking at a very small set of cases, Latin America and Southern Europe in particular, is that there's a split between hardliners and softliners in the regime, moderates versus radicals in society, and there is a negotiated outcome of this split. The advantages are that it limits the agenda of policy choice rather than having a rabble out on the streets of Cairo saying we need, higher salaries, or we need job security, or we need higher pensions, or we want the military to come in, or we want the Islamists to come in. Instead, you're sitting around a table, you're deciding who will get what in terms of representation. Elites are representing what in some of the literature is called pillared communities, well organized, and it's an orderly transition that limits this agenda of policy choices. It restricts participation in the decision-making process. And in order for this to work, though, you have to have this very, it turns out, unusual situation, which is this equal balance of power between the old regime and new contestants in the process. So the process is cooperative, and it's everybody gets something. So it's non-zero sum. Everybody wins. It also comes out of, this transition comes out of this elite strategic interaction. And so you get this situation where you have democracy without democrats. That is, there's no, okay, so this is a theory, right? I know you're going to attack me and say, Kathryn, this is ridiculous. There's no place in the world this has happened. This was the dominant way of looking at transitions after 1974. People looked at modernization theory and said, okay, that may be some of the European story, that's not our story. And instead, people like O'Donnell and Schmitter looked around and found all of these cases where this paradigm, pacted outcomes, were dominant. And again, they're looking at Latin America and they're looking at Southern Europe. So elites have no commitment to democracy. It's not as though, Locke's treatise on government has fallen down and hit them on the heads, and they think, oh my gosh, let's liberalize. That they may not know anything about it. It's just a strategic way for them to possibly get back into power. Okay, the problem is that that doesn't fit what happens after 1991. So, Dennis, here's Manejная площадь before the shopping center. You're probably too, do you remember? Probably too young to remember this, but there's an
shopping center is here now.
Now it's here. There's a shopping center here. This is right outside. The Kremlin is here in Red Square. And now there's an underground shopping center.
And they built,
here.
arguably they built the shopping center to prevent this from happening.
Exactly. Dennis, how pessimistic and cynical of you. So, intriguingly, the shopping center has, whoops, what did I do here? Let's get back to it. Intriguingly, the shopping center has solar or windows, skylights, so that if you stood on it in a protest like this, you would fall through. So, hey, that was the best design. Anyway, yes, so many thousands of people out on this main square, right outside Red Square in Moscow. This is March 1991. This is before the collapse of the Soviet Union, which occurs when? What's the actual day the Soviet Union falls?
December 25th.
1st of
Yes.
December.
25th of December, 1991, hammer and sickle flag goes down over the Kremlin, and the tricolor Russian flag that everybody forgot about goes up over the Kremlin. Names change, brutal. Gorbachev's name comes off the door. Yeltsin's name is on the door. And that's it. Gorbachev is a president without a country. He's accepted it now, but anyway, we'll talk about him in a second. So the problem with the third wave paradigm is here we are in 1991 in Moscow, and these are not elites out having a nice chat about who's going to get what, right? It's rabble out on the streets. It's the masses. And this doesn't exactly fit modernization theory either. It's not because the economy was doing great that people are out on the streets here. Now, actually, if you look very, very carefully in the crowd, you'll see me yelling "Doloi KPSS," down with the Communist Party. Anyway, I wasn't arrested, so that was good. But it was a thrill. And there were many, many such mobilizations.
You were really there?
Yeah. Yeah, I was there. It was fun. I went to a lot of those protests. Now I can't go, but. So anyway, looking at that, this doesn't fit the third wave. Some smart folks, including our colleague Mike McFall and Steve Fish at Berkeley, and Valerie Bunce, who's at Cornell, pointed out that, hey, you know, if you look at transitions that have occurred and the fall of authoritarian regimes, step one in the transition, it's not all about elites, as O'Donnell and Schmitter are telling us, happened in Latin America and Southern Europe. It's not a nice conversation where they're deciding who gets what and what the rules will be and what the Constitution will look like. It's a bunch of folks out demanding the end of the Communist Party or the down with the Soviet Union. I could have shown you, terrific pictures from Eastern Europe as well of people scrambling over the Berlin Wall, of course, right, 2 years earlier. Actors here are not elites, and they're not just elites, and they're not just masses, which is what modernization theory would tell us, right? It's both. So this looks to be, a new paradigm, a new way of transition occurring. Pacts are the exception, not the rule. Can you think of the one country where we could say pacts occurred in, for example, Eastern Europe, 1989? A pact.
I think you were giving an example.
No, that was later. That was a war.
Yeah, that was too.
That was later, right.
That was a
Right.
different thing.
Former
That
Yugoslavia.
was a peace agreement.
Yeah, that's not a pact, right? You're right.
Did East Germany?
No.
Poland?
What?
Poland?
Poland is right. There's no prize, but good. It's Poland, right. Poland's as close as we can come. They had this series of roundtable talks where there was a discussion about what the Constitution would look like, what the rules of the game would be, who would get what, the rules of the founding election. But that was, of course, in the wake of Lech Walesa taking people to the streets and fighting martial law, but that's as close as we can come to the pacting example. Pretty much every other transition that took place was a combination of elite and mass action. And we can look around the world and see other examples of this too, before 1989, for example. We can look to the Philippines and see it. We'll hear hopefully about Burma and whether or not this fits with what the Burmese transition has been like so far. So pacts here are the exception, not the rule. This has been good and bad in terms of consolidation as we get toward that conversation. The agenda of policy choice isn't limited. It's all over the place. We got to do everything at once. And in many of the transitions after 1989, of course, they were economic transitions as well as political transitions. So really a unique historical event in that sense, since we begin tracking transitions to democracy, because you have this massive change from a planned economy where this is actually how I got interested in studying the Soviet Union, was through the economy, because every single input and output was planned, was supposed to be planned, right? This just strikes me as incredibly odd coming from a market economy, and I found it so fascinating as an undergraduate. I wanted to figure out how they possibly could do this, and it turns out they couldn't, which is one of the reasons the Soviet Union collapses. But they have to create from scratch stock markets, real estate markets, every kind of free enterprise out there. They have to privatize They have to, convince people that unemployment is not the end of the world. You can get re-employment. So massive, massive agenda of policy change. We don't, because it's not a pact, you don't get the benefits of transition distributed evenly. So we're starting to get to Gina's question of inequality. And this certainly happens in other transitions that occur after 1989 in different parts of the world. The outside decision makers are not just elites. We get new actors rising to the top in many of these places as well. The process is not cooperative, right? It's not zero sum. I mean, it is zero sum, pardon me. It's not, there isn't sort of shared benefits as there is for pacting. So there are winners and there are losers. You get democracy with Democrats here. There are people who believe in the legitimacy of democracy. It's not just a strategic decision. They believe in the idea of it and different conceptions that go with it, like equality. Okay. Yeah.
I was going to say there are two pacted transitions in Latin America that took place in 1958 that people don't usually think about in this context, but it makes your point about why they're sometimes not such great solutions. And one was the National Front in Colombia, and then the other was the Pacto de Punto Fijo in Venezuela. Both of them were elite pacts that cut out, any kind of mass participation, and both set up next 2-3 decades of instability in both of those countries.
Right, yeah, and the problem with pacting is that it freezes relationships at a certain historical point, and society moves on. And so some of the losers in that initial pact, even though the ideal of the model is that everybody wins, those grievances can last and eventually burst out. So the fourth thing I wanted to mention is that in the third wave sort of paradigm where we focus just on elites, they also tend not to look at external actors and what external actors can or cannot do in encouraging transitional moments. It's an interesting conversation as to whether or not democracy or a transition, if not a consolidated democracy, and remember I'm separating the two for today, whether it can be imposed from outside. Did we do that with Iraq? Do we have, I think we have a pretty low quality democracy. That's as far as I would go in Iraq. Is that what we're doing in Afghanistan? Were we successful in Germany and Japan in doing this? Is that what happened? I'm purposely putting a question mark there because it's not clear to me that it's only external actors that have brought about these outcomes. What can external actors do to encourage transition? Well, when we looked at successes and failures in this book, the successes, first of all come within. So it's not, external actors don't bring about democracy. So despite conspiracy theories, in fact, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine was not the result of the CIA. I think those people who believe in that theory think the CIA is way more competent than it actually is. But there are some things that external actors can do, and by external actors I mean states, but also foundations, to encourage transition. One is open media. So support for the media turns out to actually work. So when we look at the collapse of the Soviet Union, for example, we know that during the failed coup attempt against Gorbachev in August, that many people within Moscow were listening to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. They had illegal feeds to CNN. And independent media was broadcasting during the Orange Revolution, of course. Support for civil society organizations. The U.S. government, when we talked about the U.S. government policy cycle, Congress likes to see results fast, right? Their time horizon is 1 year to 2 years. A lot of these things, support for the media, well, we supported Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty for 30, 40 years before we saw any results. Civil society organizations, training for checking for electoral fraud may have helped in the Orange Revolution in terms of sort of showing the population that look, this election was stolen from you, but had the Supreme Court in Ukraine, or the Constitutional Court in Ukraine, not taken the decision that it did, which was brave. That was an indigenous, domestic decision that the election should be rerun.
Supreme
you know,
Court.
It's the Supreme
It was
Court.
Supreme Court, yeah.
Yeah, Supreme Court, so I was right the first time. You wouldn't have had the new election. So ultimately, domestic forces matter, but investment in civil society organizations, investment in election monitoring, that actually paid off. The other thing is demonstration effect and contagion encouragement. So when we look at Eastern Europe, for example, there's a second wave of democratization. Initially, we get kind of mixed outcomes in the 1990s, and then new waves in the late 1990s and early 2000s. They do, again, cluster together, right? So, Serbia, Georgia, Ukraine come together at the same time. The demonstration effect is something that is sort of problematic from the perspective of American policymakers. I think we're relatively split on this. There are some who think that we're not a good example anymore with things like the Patriot Act, which I know Tino talked about. But if we can demonstrate that our democracy is strong, that decisions are taken that not everyone agrees with, but everyone agrees with the process, then that shows other parts of the world that democracy is still the best form of government. So some things work, but the clear outcome of our study is that it takes a very, very long time, and you have to convince lawmakers whose time horizons are short to stick with some of these programs. I'd like to talk with you more about whether or not military action is ever successful in bringing about democratic transition and consolidation, and what your perspectives are on that, looking at where this has happened in different parts of the world. Okay, let's skip now to talk about consolidation. This is for you. Do you want to tell them what it is? You can see.
It's Independence Square.
Yeah, right. So this is during the Orange Revolution. Are you in here at all, Sergey?
Sorry?
Are you in this demonstration at all? Where are you? This is you down here, right?
On the stage.
He's blogging, right? He's blogging up here. 2004, right? The Orange Revolution. Larry's going to talk a little bit about that this afternoon. Sort of series of incredible stories. The Orange Revolution, poisonings, amazing, right? So this is the leader of the Orange Revolution. And he is poisoned at one point and disappears. And he's, I didn't bring the before and after pictures, but you can look them up. So he's a beautiful man before, gorgeous skin. And he disappears for 2 weeks. And the regime is saying, oh, he's nuts. He says he's been poisoned, blah, blah, blah. And he reemerges, and sure enough, he's been poisoned. What was the agent that was used, remember?
Sorry?
What was the chemical that he...
Dioxin.
Yes, right.
Dioxin.
Dioxin. Yeah. So clearly, really cloak and dagger, old style KGB tactics to try to knock him out of this election. Anyway, happy story in that this initial transition succeeds. When he comes into power, he's kind of a disaster. And the coalition that came together to make this successful falls apart. And former prime minister's in jail right now, intermittent hunger strikes. Anyway, Sergey can tell you all about it at lunchtime. It's a real soap opera and a sort of sad outcome. The causes of I use this picture because I think the Orange Revolution very clearly demonstrates that the causes of democratic transition are not the same as consolidation. And I think most would agree that there have been some pretty serious steps backward from a consolidated democracy in Ukraine from 2004 and the Orange Revolution. So the sort of ideals and the hopes for the Orange Revolution really weren't realized. And so that's what I want to talk about. Why is democracy perhaps not yet consolidated in countries like this? And I think this is a good day to talk about it as we look at, yet again, demonstrations looking like this. Okay, there's no Ukrainian It's in Arabic in Egypt today, right? Another evidently failed attempt at consolidation. Maybe not a failed transition yet. Maybe too early to say. Okay, Latin American friends, yeah.
Yeah, just a minor comment. That is, when you talk about the contagion environment, and you only talk about the U.S. as a factor about that.
Oh, so that the U.S. is as a demonstration effect. Contagion
Right.
is more countries
That-
close to you. So
that's-
maybe hope for Belarus.
Yeah, well, that was the point
Although,
that I
yeah.
wanted to make. Usually, for what I heard from the people who were involved in the democratic transitions in Latin America and also in Spain, when they talk about the U.S., they were more interested in they are not going to stop us, and they will not be against us trying to do this transition. And they were also all the time talking, for instance, in that moment, in that time, about Kissinger playing against them. So when Jimmy Carter arrived, it was, at least they won't get involved in this against us. On the contrary, what it was really relevant was the regional effect in the idea of, if they can do it,
Right.
we can do it.
Yeah, right.
That's
contagion,
also,
right,
or
yeah.
also,
Or diffusion.
why can they do it and not us? In
Right.
that idea.
Right.
So it was regional contagion, while the U.S. it was just green light.
So that's more external intervention. And U.S. Interests in promoting democracy versus autocracy, because sometimes the U.S. has promoted autocracy, of course, is a topic that we'll move to toward the end of the program. But when I was using the example of the U.S., it was more, if we show the outside world that our democracy is intact, then that demonstration effect could encourage others. I think there's a pretty weak link. The contagion effect is different. It's when other countries in your neighborhood are transiting to democracy. Then, that, if you look at 1989 in Eastern Europe, right, you see a contagion then. You see contagion, arguably, between 2003 and 2006 again. So that's more contagion. It's if they can do it, why not us? And you see it in Latin America as well. So that's why I said maybe hope for Belarus, but Belarus lives in an unstable neighborhood in that respect. Gina.
I'm sorry, maybe I'm going to make a question too late. I'm a bit slow today. But then, isn't it too early to talk about democratic consolidation? Maybe if they are not yet in democratic transition. So then, when do you consider a situation as a democratic transition? It is just elections, because then democracy is not just elections. So I just don't get it.
We didn't rehearse this before, but look at my next slide, right? So let's start with the last point here, which is time. And that's a very reasonable question and one that plagues everybody. And I think this might be why Frank doesn't like to separate transition from consolidation, right? You see it as all one continuing process, right? And would it be fair to say that that you would view it as a distinct possibility that a country could go back at any particular time as well? Right, so that's a perfectly reasonable position. Sam Huntington, his mentor, comes up with this rather arbitrary two-turnover test, which is a very high test. So this is basically saying that a new government comes in, it must eventually lose in elections and turn over power to another party. That party must lose and turn over power again to either the first party or a completely new one. So 2 turnovers. Now, how long does that take? 50 years? 60 years? Has Japan met that standard? That's why it's a high standard. Why 2 turnovers and not 1? Kind of arbitrary. So that sort of, the critiques of this give Frank's position some, I think, further strengthening of how long should it take. It's kind of like pornography. We know it when we see it, but a consolidated democracy, but I can't quite describe it to you exactly. My standard might be different than yours. Fernando.
Yeah, in the book or the chapter you gave us to read, you make a big point, and in your presentation, regarding the participation of people, comparing to the League Pact of the past, in the new transitions to democracy.
I'm guessing it's somebody's cell phone.
Oh, I was guessing it was the National Security Agency. Hey, go ahead.
Yeah, you made this comparison in terms of the new transitions were promoted more by the people rather than an elite pact.
Yep.
I think the issue deserves more analysis because I will invite you to run a test in different countries in terms of to what extent the previous elites were replaced when democracy came.
Yep.
And I can tell you that in the case of Chile, that didn't happen.
Yep.
And I could seriously argue that Chile wasn't an elite pact transition to democracy.
Which time are you're talking about with the referendum?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. No, fair enough. That's true.
In Mexico, it didn't happen.
Right.
PRI lost 2 elections and then it came back, and right now is again in power.
Right.
And
so when I was referring to Latin American pacts, I was actually referring to the 1960s and 70s, not more recent transitions.
yeah, but in the paper, I think Mexico and Chile are presented as cases where the elites didn't play a huge role in the transitions to democracy.
Okay, so if you look at those chapters, you get a better sense of what we mean by that, which is that, and I didn't assign them, but you know, you're welcome to take a look at them in the book here. I can give it to you. It's specifically taking on the third wave paradigm of elite pacting. So it's not saying that old elites had absolutely no role. They were all stomped down and they started with a blank slate. It's that it was more a result of, they weren't all swept out of office. It was more, the transition came about as a result of, you know, either being elected out or, so it's not suggesting that old elites don't play some role, if that's your point.
And yeah, and at the end, I will have a very, I will say a very polemic argument, which is that probably some of the problems of consolidation of democracy in some countries are the result of not having the elites actually playing a very important role during the transitional period.
Ah, interesting. So you have a new group of elites coming in, or just?
No, you don't have elites, and that's the problem. There is this assumption.
Because of a lack of organization or institutionalization of processes, governing processes, or?
Not only government processes, but a coherent group of people that are able to lead the country in a much more institutionalized way and in a democracy.
Sure.
Some of the problems in Latin America consolidation of democracy, or some of the problems that our democracies are suffering, are in part because you don't have political parties, you don't have programmatic parties, you don't have a business community that is able to interact with politics in a more institutionalized way. And that's the price that we paid in terms of not having a functional elite for the country.
Right, and so I think you would see that, and when I get to looking at Russia a little bit, that's part of the Russian story as well, a lack of institutionalization. Some of that's on purpose, because it allows leaders to be a little more dexterous in terms of...
A little bit more?
Dexterous, being able to move around more freely. If you're not tied to a political party, for example, I'm thinking of Boris Yeltsin here. So in the Russian Constitution, it is forbidden for the president to be a member of a political party.
What? What is that?
The Russian president is not supposed to be a member of a political party. And this
as in Ukraine, by the way.
As in Ukraine. Yeah, this was by design in Russia. It was Yeltsin's idea. He said that the president should be above politics. Now, this is not a figurehead. It was extremely ironic, given this is a presidential republic. I mean, a very, very strong executive. Dennis has
I
asked a
think
couple of questions.
this is the story for
into-
all the former Soviet countries.
Right. So, I mean, tell us about Ukraine, for example. Same thing.
Like in
right?
Armenia, it's the same.
Armenia
You
is
don't
the
have to be a political figure.
Right.
I mean,
What
you
about-
are a political figure,
Right.
but you are not affiliated to a
With a
political
party. Right. So even though President Putin has a party he prefers, United Russia, technically he's not a member of that party. And President Medvedev, who started United Russia, was not a member technically when he was president. Is that the same in Georgia? No, it's different. Right.
The president is a member of the political.
Right. So that's different. Yeah. So anyway, yes, and that was by design. I think Yeltsin probably demonstrated that to the others, dare I say, because there was a lot of distrust in society of parties, and institutionalization of parties in the wake of the Communist Party running the Soviet Union. So that was one reason. The second was he wanted to be nimble in terms of policy. He tried a lot of things, and most of them didn't work. But he didn't want a political party deciding, as recently happened in Australia, for example, you know what, we don't want you to be our leader anymore, so we're going to vote you out. Or you're not following our program. He wanted to make up the program as he went along, as opposed to being bound to this party. So as a result, very weak institutionalization of parties as well. Okay, so what are factors that, if you look at different studies on democratic transition and consolidation, that facilitate consolidation? Definite correlation here again with wealth. And this is a very long quote from a Polish guy, Jaworski. I know it starts with a P, but it's pronounced Jaworski. That basically says that democracies are more likely to be found in highly developed countries. The reason they're more likely to emerge when countries develop is that, the reason is not that democracies are more likely to emerge when countries develop under authoritarianism, but that, however they do emerge, that is democracies, they're more likely to survive in countries that are already developed. So having growth ahead of time has a lot to do with survivability. So here's some new democracies and economic performance. Life expectancy of a democracy with a decline in incomes is 19 years. Life expectancy of a democracy with a rise in incomes is 64 years. So growth is good for consolidating democracy. Okay, we're going to come back to Gina's earlier question about distribution, right? Income equality is conducive to democratic consolidation. This is a huge problem in many parts of the world, that income is unequal. And thinking about Russia through the 1990s, the case I want to get to, this is a huge problem. There is tremendous inequality. The Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality that allows you to compare between countries, puts, Russia went from, communism, which if you have a 0.0, then you're a perfectly equal country. So let's say it went from that to over 0.4, so pretty unequal. Now, there are countries represented in the room that are far, far higher than that in terms of how unequal they are. But this is a huge problem, and Gina mentioned it as well, very destabilizing. You can think about the Arab Spring. Was that a problem? Is that partly what caused the uprisings in the Arab Spring? I think it's part of it, wouldn't you? All right, the form of transition, what was there before? And this is partly, I think, what Fernando was talking about. Does it matter what kind of regime type was there? I want to talk about that in a minute. Does it matter whether the transition comes from below, that is from society, and is nonviolent? There are some authors who argue yes. So, for example, they would predict in Rwanda, very unlikely to be, a success unless somehow those disputes between different ethnicities that caused the genocide are brought back into balance somehow, or were settled. Same would be the case in Bosnia and Herzegovina, right? Because it was so violent. What came before? Pacted transitions, more likely to last. Some would argue because there is this kind of distributional agreement on who gets what. Huntington has this really, I told you, he's very pragmatic. So he has this really interesting chapter about what to do with old elites. What do you do with the torturers? Do you do what South Africa did and have truth and reconciliation trials? Do you basically pay them off and get them to go live quietly in the country? Do you throw them in jail? How you settle this is very important to the consolidation of the new regime. So if we think about Libya, Huntington would say having Gaddafi killed the way he was is not good for consolidation of authority and democracy in Libya, because what you want to impress upon people in the new system is procedure, right? So instead, what happened in Iraq with Saddam Hussein being pulled publicly from his little wormhole, being put on trial publicly, and then being hung, not necessarily having that shown on television everywhere. Huntington would say that was the way to do it, because you impressed upon people there's a system of justice here. He was given the opportunity to defend himself. He was found guilty, sentence carried out. People have faith in the system. You could argue, Huntington would also say what was happening with Mubarak was the right thing as well for the new system. He was brought into court, charges laid against him. He was given the opportunity to defend himself, except the process sort of stopped, right? So reasonably, people would lose faith in it. So what you do with the torturers makes a big difference. The important point, Huntington would say, is that people see that the new regime has a different process for handling offenses and human rights offenses than the old regime. And it's again, about procedure is the important thing. Institutional choices matter. So what is put in that constitution actually matters. A parliamentary system versus a presidential system, for example. Ethnic homogeneity is helpful for consolidation, but you can't choose that, right? So that's kind of not, that's merely an observation, not very helpful, right? You can't force intermarriage to get rid of certain ethnicities. Okay, we talked about diffusion already. Performance, we talked about economic performance. That's good for consolidation. Political performance is very tightly tied to that. And this is a lot of the story in Russia in the 1990s. It was a performance legitimacy story. There was inequality. Yeltsin inherited a system that was a mess. He made it worse in many respects, but there was 70 years of communism that went before it. And one of the reasons that the old regime began to crack, and when Gorbachev came into power, he said infamously, "Tak žít nelzya," living this way is impossible, right? It had to change. He could see all the problems in the system. The planning system didn't work. There was tremendous corruption. They couldn't keep up in the arms race with the United States. All of these problems existed. Society had developed and the system had not. People didn't believe, the mythology of communism anymore. All of this happened. So its political performance was not enough to sustain it anymore. Well, the same is true with new democracies. The political performance, the procedure was not viewed as legitimate as the 1990s wore on in Russia. It was unequal. Yeltsin may have spun the 1996 election. He had an aide discovered with $500,000 leaving the Russian White House at the time. It looked dishonest. So again, undermines these new democracies. And we just talked about time. How long should it take? Okay, so this is the same quote. We looked at this. Why is wealth good for democracies? Well, this is a huge question, this first question here. Do democracies govern better? What do you think? Yeah, I heard somebody say, yeah, sure. Sergey. Yeah, why do you think?
It's clear.
Uh-huh.
Democracy is better.
Okay.
So no, it depends on what you look.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Look at the competitiveness index. Singapore is the first now. I mean, it depends on the values and expectations you have from public government.
Okay.
I mean, it
Sultan?
depends.
I don't think
if you, if you
sorry.
I'm sorry, if you value the process, maybe the democracy is the best solution. But if you look at the outcomes,
Everything is here.
I don't know.
But
I don't know.
look, after Orange Revolution, it was democracy in Ukraine. Now we have autocratical president, and when he was elected, he promised to keep Ukraine in order, but economical growth, we don't see economical growth in Ukraine after this.
So,
Keeping order in Ukraine.
so in that case, autocracy is worse than democracy.
So
Okay.
he promised, but he did not achieve this result.
Sure. Okay, so lots of disagreement in the room. Yep, Sultan.
I don't think democracy is governed better necessarily, but if democracy is governed badly, you can throw them out. That's the difference.
Right, right. Whereas you're stuck with your Robert Mugabe, right? He thinks the people will go before him. Okay, right. So, most of us would, there's serious self-selection in the room, right? I'm guessing that pretty much all of us here would prefer to live in a democracy than in an autocracy. But you want a democracy that's going to meet your needs, right? Or a system that's going to meet your needs. You're going to be just as unhappy in a democracy that is unable to provide you with clean water and enough to eat, and where you have job prospects and opportunities. You can't eat freedom, right? So there's that argument. But autocracies do just as badly, right, in that respect. And you can't throw them out. That's true. So there isn't actually clear evidence that democracies govern better, and this is we have research projects on this here at CDDRL, from a pure provision of public goods and services, right? So there are lots of reasons why they should, because of accountability, right? And the fact that you can throw people out, that you can contact your representative, your elected representative, and voice your grievances. You can't do that in most autocracies. But in fact, it isn't always the case, partly because democracy is a system of inherent conflict, right? So the opposition and the party that's ruling are constantly debating policies, and so you might get a substandard policy. Or a policy that benefits specific interests because they were in the coalition, and without their support, the government will fall. So it doesn't always produce better outcomes, but there are lots of other reasons to want to live in a democracy, right? Freedom of speech, greater equality potentially. Is democracy good for the poor? That's another question. Not always. It's not always good for the poor. It's not always better for the poor, necessarily. It can give increased opportunity, but just the very act of voting isn't enough necessarily to lift the prospects of poor people. And whether or not poor people vote is another question. So democracy is, again, a conflictual system, right? But still the best of bad alternatives. Not necessarily the best system from a governance perspective. People always point to Singapore, right? Look at that. It's not a democracy. Everything's great. Can't, no gum on the sidewalks, no chewing gum on the sidewalks. Well-governed place.
Singapore is a very small country.
Exactly.
How can we use this like example?
Sure.
It's less than half of our capital.
I would totally agree. Yeah. What kind of example is that? It's not scalable. That's the very common.
But everybody uses it.
Everybody uses it, exactly, as the example, but that's completely correct, right? It's kind of an outlier. It's unusual, right? You've got Singapore, but you've also got, dare I say, Zimbabwe, right?
Yeah, but some countries are even smaller than Singapore, so they like that example.
Yeah, sure.
A lot of countries.
So democracy may lower the intensity of distributional conflicts, right? You don't have to, look at Egypt right now. Or, there are lots of other examples. The way people think they can change policy and, shorten the gas lines and lower food prices is to get out into Tahrir Square. That's not a way to govern, right? You can't always do that. You eventually have to have institutions that you trust to put in place policies that are implemented that increase everybody's well-being. Democracy could lower the intensity of these distributional conflicts if the rules are such that there's appropriate representation of different groups within society. And I mean socioeconomic groups, ethnic groups. That depends on the rules. It can, but if the rules don't benefit different socioeconomic groups, then distributional conflicts, fights over land and money can be very intense in democracies. Yep, Emmanuel.
Yes, thank you. I think democracy on a bigger scale is a better idea for most countries.
A bad idea.
A better idea.
Bad.
But when you come to certain contexts, such as I'm thinking of Kenya, for example, whereby you have tribes which are big and all that, and what everyone is thinking about is how to win the elections. So you don't care so much about the other constituencies. What you care most is the constituency that brings you to power. So that will be actually extremely detrimental in certain contexts.
Right, right. And again, that's the rules, right? And sort of getting the rules right. I'm just checking on how long we have. Okay, we have till 10:30. Right. So, when you say do democracies govern better? I mean, that's a very difficult question because democracies are not all the same, right? Quality differs, rules differ. But as Sultan said, the big advantage is if things aren't going well, you can vote people out.
Yeah, but in the context of Kenya, it's really difficult because
to vote them out.
You have a majority which you have to please and will keep you in power. So if you displease everyone else but please the majority, mostly the tribe which you come from, then you'll be in power for quite some time.
Yeah. So and Kenya's not the only system where that's the issue.
Maybe the question is if democracy can give better good governors, if you want, just like so they would feel accountable, they would feel less abusing the system. And just I wonder sometimes, when you want better equality and you want all these dreams for your country, how it can be done. It's always about the individual. It's always about the person or the politician who is ruling. So sometimes maybe you have a good king and he's better than any other democracy. But sometimes if you have the son of the king who's really bad and he can put everything else in question. So maybe democracy is a kind of stability, but also how to improve the people who are governing and the way they see power.
Right. And actually, you could argue that democracy also trains leaders, right? So that you can, you have to hope that the king's son is not an idiot, frankly, right? But he could be, like little Prince George here in Britain. We don't know. Maybe he's an idiot. Luckily, he really won't have any power, right?
They named him? His name is George?
His name is George, yeah. George Alexander Louis. Yeah. George Alexander Louis. But in a democracy, especially if you have, the virtue of it is repeat election cycles, and you don't just have it at the national level, but you also have it at the local level, then you are also training a generation of potential new leaders who are investing in that system, who will see what works and what doesn't in terms of governing. You don't get that in a monarchy. Darko, and then I'll move on a little bit.
Yeah, I'll just be brief. Basically, this just got me to think. I think we are more focusing on the people governing. I think the democracy is basically very much, as the word says itself, is very much like depending on the society itself. It's depending on the maturity of the people that are actually doing the decision making on elections. So the level of maturity of the society actually is a thing that defines the success of democracy in that matter. So and in autocratic regimes you have to depend on the ruler this way. I mean, training is a good word to say it, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's to a certain extent it's training the leaders, but actually it's like training the people society. Also and the society. I think that's important to stress out when we are talking about
and that's a really
democracy.
interesting point that we haven't raised, and I'm surprised that it's taken us an hour and 20 minutes to bring it up, which is it's political culture, right? So so the issue with that though is first, a couple of questions back. What do you need from society, right, to have the right culture for democracy? First, do you need a certain education level? Well, we've seen that illiterate people can vote just as well as literate people. Do you need, and that happens in India, maybe an imperfect democracy, but one that's widely accepted as a democracy. How would people get the right culture or values from where would those come? Is it, could be diffusion. It could be education. It could be just repeating the procedure of elections. So,
Yeah, but if you want to believe in democracy, that's the only way to go. As far as I think, and actually, it's different actors. It's the government, it's the civil society, it's the media. Everybody gets into and also it's the society. I mean, in different cases, you got like conflicts in the society that actually, as he was saying, kind of prevent democracy from happening. And in the other cases, you got value issues. Like for instance, in some cases like Bosnia, it's combined. It's the value issue as a very conservative society plus the conflict that's actually preventing it from happening. So but you need different actors to work, and it's not like there's no. As far as I think, there's not a unique solution. It depends on the country and on the society.
Yeah, well, and I think we're getting into issues of sort of consolidation and quality of democracy, right? Deepening it. So, the best we could do in, let's say, Iraq, for example, or even in Russia, is initially, they set up institutions for voting, right? Because there's no prior culture of, liberty and freedom of speech, and the Russian government didn't hand out copies of, Locke and Mills, et cetera. So the only way that people could kind of learn the benefit of the system was to live it, right? And gradually you have civil society groups and political parties begin to form in these new systems, and that's how the institutions are formed. But then the institutions have to get deeper and deeper into society to consolidate. I think that's very reasonable. So I only have about 7 minutes left, and I haven't really talked much about Russia. So do you guys want to make it quick? And I only want to use it as a very quick example about what went wrong, what goes wrong.
No, I will try to be quick. But if I were to analyze democratic transitions and consolidation, I would focus more on the role of the security institutions.
Okay, look at that. We didn't talk ahead of time. We didn't, right.
Okay.
Yeah, rehearse this.
Okay.
Okay, no, go ahead, right.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to remind you that, for example, yesterday when we were watching the movie, we have seen the critical role of the police. If the police were part of it, maybe it would have been a lot more difficult. We see the role that the military is playing in Egypt.
Yep.
In all fragile, transitioning democracies, the role of the security sector is crucial.
Sure.
And finally, to give you the example of my country, if we survived all these tensions we went through last year, it was generally because of the neutrality of the security sector. But
right.
if President Wade had the military and the police in his side, for sure Senegal would have not been the Senegal we have today.
Right. No, very important point. And security order is basically, the kind of first precondition, perhaps, or the promise of it. That is the legitimacy of security organizations. Certainly a huge problem in Iraq, even today. Certainly a huge problem in Afghanistan and many other places as well. Do you mind if I just move on, because I'm going to run out of time, but I'll make you first in the next round. How about that? Okay, quick comment. Okay. I don't want to be a dictator. Let it not be said.
A benevolent one.
Just very short one. My comment is about Thailand democracy.
Okay.
Thailand have now 60-year democracy, but the problem now we see is likely society are divided. Not consolidation happening. And because of during the Thaksin government, he spent a lot. He used the money politics. But he provide good delivery service for the people, but at the same time he take a lot of profits for him. So we did not see greater equality in that situation. Now in Thailand the situation is very bad. So some are trying to build the institution again, but some people are satisfied with money politics. So these
right.
I would like to share about
So getting the security forces on to be neutral. Right, they back the state, not a particular person, is obviously crucially important. Okay, well, thanks for that. Right, so democracy is a very fragile thing to maintain, right? Because societies change, right? The sort of ethnic majority could change over time. And so one of the things that should be an advantage of democracy is the institutions are more flexible than they would be under an autocratic system, so that you'd be able to sort of respond to the pressure of changing, as you mentioned in Thailand, a little bit better. That's not always the case, but at least democracies have that potential. Okay, so this is just a comment on whether it matters in terms of successfully transiting, whether prior regime type matters. And there's some research done on this, and some of it I just thought I'd run through just for a second because it's kind of interesting. So this is a woman at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, Barbara Geddes, who's written a lot on Latin America. And if you think about Egypt, right, and how are these different lessons applicable, maybe it's okay that the Egyptian military is coming out right now. They purport to be responding, after all, to the demands of the people on the street for order and better governance. Barbara Geddes has found, by looking at Latin America and different military coups and then restorations of democracy, that military juntas are actually easier to democratize. Soldiers obey orders. And they go back to the barracks when they're told to go back to the barracks. They don't want to govern, ultimately. But they don't want bad civilian governance either. Pakistan kind of fits this, goes up and down, right? The role of the military.
Very difficult.
Old institutions can also be revived. So it's this, in effect, a situation of a military junta could be a re-democratization. I'm not sure that fits Egypt particularly well, but it does fit some Latin American countries. Personalist regimes are easier to democratize. There are usually, so maybe this is hopeful for Zimbabwe. There's a small group of people relying on the state for wealth. When the leader dies, you can get rid of them and the leader at the same time. The question, though, is who governs after the death of a dictator, if not someone from this small group. Hegemonic party systems, that is where you have a big party that is in control of the system, are sort of the third easiest to democratize. They have a bigger selectorate, that is, they're nationally known. The research shows that they can withstand challenges or crises, economic crises in particular, better than generals and personalist dictators. They can co-opt them, and they have the all-important sort of name recognition and legitimacy from having governed before. Okay. So here's some different survivability rates. You'll get these slides, so you don't have to rush to it. And this is a sample again. I think this is from Geddes as well. It shows you how long these autocracies, for example, survive. Theocracies, not as long-lived, although Iran, we'll see what happens. Okay, does institutional choice matter in consolidating democracy? And this is what I was really going to use the Russian case, which I've now pretty much given up on. Yes, it seems to matter tremendously. Here's the problem. A parliamentary system is better from the perspective of survivability. So everybody understands that the prime minister comes out of the party that gets the most number of votes in the election, right? He or she is not directly elected. They win their own seat, but the party that gets the most number of votes, the leader of that party becomes prime minister, okay? That's a parliamentary system. Presidential system, there's a direct election for president. He's head of the executive. The executive doesn't come out of parliament in the same way as in a parliamentary system. Separate election. The problem is that most new democracies choose a presidential system. Why do you think they do that?
Personality oriented?
Personality?
Well, I think it makes sense because they are normally from a very autocratic regime. And mostly with these changes, there's a champion in this change, and they feel they trust that person to have some powers.
Yeah, although
and as well,
there's the danger of him taking, or her, more likely him, dare I say.
And as well, they want to feel responsible to electing someone, they as opposed to having a leader of a party who they don't necessarily have a direct role in electing.
Okay. Okay, so there's a legitimacy issue. People
Yeah.
feel comfortable with this, being able to identify Vladimir Putin. He's our president, right? Okay. Okay. Why? Any other reason?
I think that as for ex-Soviet Union, they were just copying U.S. model.
Okay. Not just, but that was partly it. But yeah, it's because. Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
And last year it's very popular to follow the Singapore example also, because everybody read the book of Lee Kuan Yew and trying to follow his experience.
Yeah. Right. Right.
But that's parliamentary.
But you have there.
That he can't be cloned and taught Ukrainian. Yeah.
You have the Latin American countries there that were already presidential system before democracy went down.
Sure. Okay. So there's that as well. Sure. It's actually because it tends to be because parliamentary systems are slower in making decisions and a little more unstable. So if you think of Italy, for example, you have to get a coalition in many parliamentary systems in order to rule. It partly depends on the electoral system that you choose, whether you do a proportional representation system or first past the post, but it's partly that. It's because of the instability, and also because of inherently you have to debate everything and compromise. And a lot of countries that are transitioning are also in deep economic trouble. So, for example, in the former Soviet cases, the new presidents or new leaders coming in felt that, look, you know what? I'm going to impose a neoliberal economic reform program. Many thought this, not all, of course. And this is Yeltsin's case. I cannot debate with this intransigent bunch of communists. I got to get it through. And so I need all of this executive authority. And so he had a constitution written in 1993 after he bombed Parliament. They tried to impeach him, to be fair, twice. But he had a constitution written that gave him supreme executive authority as president because he didn't want to have to deal with a bunch of intransigents, basically. He didn't want to have to debate some of the very, very difficult policies that he initially tried to implement and then had to back off from anyway. Turned out it wasn't just because he had a parliamentary system initially to deal with, or a stronger parliament, not a pure parliamentary system. So that's part of the reason why. Okay, but look at the longevity of parliamentary systems. This very act of being forced to negotiate is good for democracy. You're forced to incorporate a plurality of interests. They're not so rigid. Conflicts are not zero-sum, right? The president isn't embarrassed if he loses a debate, or the prime minister is not embarrassed if they lose on one issue. It encourages more compromise and incorporation of different views. So they tend to last longer. Unfortunately, no one chooses them. Chooses that system. Okay, lessons from Russia. I'm screaming it out in big font there, really fast. Quick refresher. I'll just do this in 5 minutes. It's going to be incredible, Larry. Gorbachev. You guys remember who he is?
Yeah.
Here he is now. Look, he's aged. It's sort of sad. He actually makes money, and if you have your computer open, you can Google this up. Google. I know.
What? What?
Google Gorbachev Louis Vuitton.
What's that?
Louis
Vuitton. Gorbachev and Louis Vuitton. Okay, there's this rather infamous ad of Gorbachev in the back of a limousine going past remnants of the Berlin Wall with his Louis Vuitton. Have you seen this, Dennis? This Louis Vuitton bag next to him on the seat.
And Pizza Hut.
You got to make a living. You have to make a living.
gosh.
Anyway, I'm a big Gorby fan. I think he's cool.
It is better than Pizza Hut, you know?
It's bad, could be worse. But Bono also has one of these ads. But anyway, Google it up. You'll see it. It's quite, are you looking for it, Gina? Look for it. Somebody look for it. It's quite good. Okay, so anyway, 1985 to 91, he is the last, of course, General Secretary of the Communist Party. He comes in, says, "Tak žít nelze, we can't live like this any longer, or living this way is impossible." And so he introduces perestroika, this reform program, glasnost, opening, freedom of speech. He sort of stops and starts with market reforms. He opens up the electoral process. Huge mistake. He himself doesn't run for office. He doesn't run for popular office. He is elected indirectly to this new super parliament he creates. And this turns out to have been a big mistake for him in staying in politics, because his big rival, Boris Yeltsin, runs for this new post of Russian president, and wins it in June of 1991 and has all of this popular legitimacy as a result. There's an attempted coup by his own Politburo against Gorbachev in August of 1991. He is at his dacha, and on August 19th, we are told on the radio that he's sick. And by the way, there's also this state of emergency. Everything's okay. He's not dead, he's just sick. So then a drunken group of the Politburo, I can't make this stuff up, right? You've got your poisoned president. Russia has this drunken group of coup plotters that appear on national television saying, we're in charge. And it's the Politburo. I'm not joking. Drunk as skunks, one of them in particular.
Were you there then?
No, I was watching that. I was watching from Massachusetts in the middle of a hurricane. I was actually looking after my dissertation supervisor's house, who had my entire career in his hands. I parked his car outside in the garage, and a tree fell on it and broke the car. So August 19th, terrible day for me. Anyway, I finished the program, everything worked out. We're still friends. So bad day for Gorbachev, bad day for me. Boris Yeltsin somehow, this Keystone Cops group of the Politburo, somehow they miss picking up this newly elected president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin. He manages to scramble out of his dacha and get back to Moscow, stand on a tank. Do you have this picture in your house of Yeltsin on the tank? Or, no, okay. I did for a while, but I'm over it now. He gets on a tank and in front of the White House, and it's his finest moment. And speaking of the military, he talks the military down. So the military ends up supporting him. That's it. Coup over by the 21st. Guys go to jail. Then they're let out later. But there's a successful coup, basically, that's conducted by Yeltsin. He gradually takes over all of the institutions of the Soviet Union through the fall of 1991. Gorbachev's running around desperately saying, let's have a new Commonwealth. Let's have a loose federation. Nobody really wants to deal with him. And he is kind of shocked on December 25th when his name comes down from his office in the Kremlin. And he goes off into the sunset and does these Louis Vuitton ads to make some money. Actually, he has a foundation. He's kind of a great guy, but he's written some sort of revisionist things about himself. It turns out he was a Democrat, even though they used to call him Последний Bolshevik, right? The last Bolshevik, because you can find a lot of great quotes from Gorbachev about how great Marxism is, and I really believe it. And so, anyway, Boris Yeltsin comes in. I was going to get a picture of him dancing. I have this great picture of him from the election in 2006, of him dancing with rock stars on the stage. He had a heart attack shortly thereafter, so I didn't bring it up. But anyway, he's elected June 1991, re-elected 1996 as president of Russia, first popularly elected president of Russia. He is a commie all the way, so talking about incorporating old elites, certainly not swept out in the Soviet transition, and this is true of many of the successor states as well. He was a party boss from Sverdlovsk Oblast, and he came into the Politburo under Gorbachev. He was the head of the Moscow Party organization. He used to ride the metro. That was a great thing about Yeltsin. He could tell you the price of bread. Gorbachev started not to like him because he was too populist, and he did the unthinkable. He criticized Gorbachev and perestroika, and then goes on television during this filmed Congress doing that as well. And he says, perestroika is going too slowly. So he gets the heave-ho. Fascinating interaction between him and Gorbachev. He's having some kind of breakdown, Yeltsin. He's in the hospital. Gorbachev pulls him out of the hospital, fires him, puts him back into the hospital. Yeltsin had a problem with that later. And so some people think that in August of 1991, when Gorbachev comes back after this failed coup attempt, he looks like a broken man, and he comes off his plane, and Yeltsin publicly, admonishes him. And says, so where were you? What was going on? And it's very clear who's in charge. This is on national TV. Okay, So Yeltsin comes in. He tries to turn around this economy that is in effectively depression. This is called by some economists in the West the worst man-made economic crisis outside of wartime. This is even before Yeltsin tries to reform the economy. He tries shock therapy, this bundle of neoliberal reforms. He has to withdraw. He shock privatizes the country, and in some ways this is successful, in some ways not. He loses a lot of the Russian population through their faith in him through this program, however, because it starts to create oligarchs and tremendous inequality. So getting right to what Gina was talking about. So we start getting performance legitimacy. The economy is in decline. But then by 1998, there's a big crisis. They devalue, the ruble crashes. They default on loans. They decide not to take any more money from the IMF, which was the right decision. By 1999, the economy begins to grow again. However, Yeltsin has given democracy a bad name. People call it kleptocracy, basically stealing, because corruption is so high. People begin to lose faith in the legitimacy of democracy. There's a war in Chechnya that is televised, and Russian soldiers are coming back in body bags, mothers going on the front lines begging people begging commanders not to send their sons into war. Yeltsin appoints Putin. He's appointed about 5 prime ministers in a 2.5-year period. He appoints Vladimir Putin prime minister in August of 1999. Putin is not known very well. In fact, we know so little about him that a group of journalists is allowed to follow him around for about a week. It results in this little wee book called At Первого лица, from the first person, that talks. You get some wacko quotes from him. One of my favorites is, I never wanted to be president. He was forced into it against his will.
He liked it then.
Turns out he likes it, though, right? I never wanted to be president. He had never stood for election for anything before he stood for election as president in March of 2000. He is appointed acting president January 1st of 2000. And an extraordinary thing happens that I think doesn't always happen in countries in transition. Yeltsin resigns before the end of his term. He comes on television December 31st, 1999, just before midnight. Do you remember this? Did you see it? Yeah. And it's like a 2-minute thing, and everybody's like, what? Because it's a huge holiday in this part of the world, right?
The country was drunk.
Yeah, so everyone thinks, like, did I just imagine that? Did Boris Yeltsin just resign? And not only does he resign, he says, I'm appointing Vladimir Putin to take over. I told him, take care of Russia. And by the way, I'm sorry. What I thought was going to be easy turned out to be really difficult. He's referring to the entire reform period. So, right, as Sergei said, people think maybe I've imagined this, but no, sure enough, there's Putin, January 1st, 2000, acting president. He's elected in March of 2000, and he is president until 2008, and he gradually becomes more and more autocratic. There is a period between 2008 and 2012 where his protege, Dmitry Medvedev, is president. Then they tell us in 2011, the fall, that they had an agreement the whole time that Putin would come back and be president again, and Medvedev would be prime minister. But the thing is, the Russian people didn't know about this agreement, so neither did Gorbachev, and Gorbachev has come back and become quite critical. So there's this quote here saying people aren't being asked. So democracy seriously eroded in Russia from the heady days of Manege Square, which I showed you. Okay, so that's just Freedom House. But at the same time, Russia's economy has been improving, right? So it looks as though it defies modernization theory. We get economic growth, yet we get a decline in democracy. So that just shows you they come back. What happened? I'm going to skip all over this. Okay, well, there they are. This is actually my favorite picture. You get some social mobilization after this announcement that he's coming back into power. He looks like Dobby in Harry Potter to me in this picture.
Looks old.
Have you seen that movie? Yeah. This says Putin ukhadi, Putin leave. Okay, so we would never have seen this before. I'm setting Dennis up for a full table at lunch. Okay, some more popular protest. He's very popular, however, so we don't get this transitional overthrow. Instead, we get an evolution rather than a revolution and a hardening of democracy. Okay, so what are the lessons? Wealth and democracy. I just told you modernization theory has this, strong correlation. Russia's economy improved dramatically, 8% growth year on year until 2008, okay? Largely driven by oil. So wealth, in this case, didn't lead to democracy. We did see some social mobilization. That's why I wanted to show you that picture in 2011, 2012, but it's put down. He has a choice, liberalize or autocratize, and he autocratizes instead. He gets harder. Institutional choice at the moment of transition matters. I think in Russia, a crucial mistake was made in 1993 with the Constitution that created such a strong presidential republic. The president, I won't get into the powers of the presidency, but the president is the preeminent figure and can dismiss the parliament essentially at the drop of a hat. Everything is a zero-sum game in the Russian political system, I think, because of the strength of the presidential system. So this is a big mistake. Sequence of development is also a problem. When we think about rule of law and development, economic development, and democratic transition, Russia didn't have a choice in how it fit economic development and political development together. It had to do everything at once because the economy was in such a bad shape. They didn't have time to write some of the regulatory laws that Tino talked to you about with respect to the United States. They didn't have time to write a lot of these laws, conflict of interest laws. And so norms of behavior arose that ran completely contrary to the purposes of creating a market economy and private property rights and equality as well. So that was a huge problem. Performance legitimacy. Democracy was given a bad name in Russia in the 1990s because it was wrongly tied to or blamed for bad economic performance. In truth, 70 years of communism is what caused the bad economic performance. Yeltsin made some bad decisions, but that, it wasn't all his fault. But at the same time, democracy was in action, a weak democracy, liberalization at least, if not, fully consolidated democracy. Finally, external influence on the transition. How effective was it? Well, I think this really proves how ineffective external actors are in bringing about and sustaining democratic transition. In fact, it has to be a domestic constituency and civil society that moves the process forward and holds government accountable. On the margins, foreign states and foundations can provide money to keep these organizations afloat, and some of the work that you guys do is tremendously important, but we cannot force democracy anywhere. It has to come from within.